Right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest lunchtime seminar. I'm delighted to have with us Professor John Van Reenen, who is Professor of Management and Economics at MIT and previously at the LSE. Now, John has won lots of prestigious awards, but also one of the things that's really exemplified his work is that it's always been very policy relevant, and that's why it's great to have him here today, and it's also why lots of points throughout his career he's been advising policymakers in the UK and elsewhere on all sorts of things, especially related to competition and productivity and those kind of things, have been very influential on that front. And today he's going to talk about firm inequality and market power, and talk us through some of the profound consequences that some of these dynamics and changes we've seen have for kind of living standards and inequality. So it touches on lots of the stuff that we do here at the Institute, and so hopefully it'll be very interesting canter through the issues. John, we'll hear from you for about half an hour, I guess, and then open it out to a discussion.
So you want to do it that way? You don't want to, I mean, I'm happy to, however you want to. You could ask me questions
relaxed.
As I go through.
Fine. If people have
however,
them, they can fling them in.
I will try and, if there's no questions, I will try and end up in half an hour. But if there are questions, then, that's also fine. So we can actually interact. So I'm not going to give you too many answers. I'm going to give you some of the work I've been doing recently and summarise some of the other work that people have been doing around this general issue of firm dispersion, inequality, and the rise of firm market power. And this is kind of leading edge research. I think anybody knows all the answers to these things, but I think there are some facts here which do frame a lot of discussions that are first order for thinking about what's happening around the world in terms of big seismic changes. So I think if you're interested in policies around global change, then this is some of the stuff that you should know about. Okay, so one of the framing ways into this is that everybody is worried about rising firm power in terms of how firms influence markets around the world, how they're becoming bigger, how they're having more pricing power, how competition might be reducing because of this increasing power. So, this is taken from that well-known bastion of left-wing economics, The Economist, which had a leader on how, this is a report from the IMF, which was adding to this concern that there's been reduced competition around the world. What are people worried about? Well, the most salient thing, I think, is the kind of growth of what you might call superstar firms or mega firms. There's lots of acronyms for these kind of firms, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft in the digital area. GAFAMs I like because it's like GAFA, boss firms. So I like GAFAMs is a good, FANGs is another one. GAFAMs is pretty good. There's this growth of these kind of very large superstar firms which have big influence. But I'm going to show you it's not just in the digital high-tech space this has happened. This kind of growth of firm size and market concentration actually has happened across the bulk of industries in the US. A lot of the stuff I'm going to show you is on the US because there's been more analysis of the data there, but I'm also going to show you some stuff in Britain and Europe which suggests similar things are happening here as well. Again, this is not as clear as the US where most of the work has been done. So if you think about, this is true in the UK, retail grocery, Walmart and Costco, those are very large dominant firms in a very relatively lower tech type of sector. Think about FedEx in logistics and many other kind of sectors, think about banking. So this is happening actually much more widely than just in these kind of high-tech digital sectors. And of course, the growth of these kind of firms has raised concern that product market power has increased over the last 30 or 40 years. Why might we be worried about that? Well, basic economics 101 says there could be lots of negative welfare effects and increases in market power. There's inefficiencies because compared to say a more competitive benchmark, you're misallocating resources. There's also lots of evidence that when competition falls, productivity growth weakens. So this is one of the, a lot of my work is focused on how competition can be a driver for productivity by, reducing the kind of low productivity firms and increasing managerial efforts to improve productivity. And, there is, in the long run, a very strong relationship between productivity growth and average wage growth. In fact, in this country, I'll show you, there's very strong evidence of that. And it's true in most countries in the world. In the long run, if you want to get increases of average or real wage growth, you've got to have increases of productivity growth. If wage growth is outstripping productivity growth, then the only way to reconcile that in the long run is through inflation. So That's a big thing. It also, and this is the kind of a focus of my recent work, it relates to one of the other big phenomena which we've seen in the US and many other countries, which is the labour share of national income has fallen compared to the capital shares. This is the focus of Thomas Piketty's book. And there's actually a relationship between the growth of these superstar firms and this fall of the labour share. And of course, why do we care about the fall of the labour share? Well, there's two reasons. One is that if the economic pie was growing very quickly, we might not care if labour share was going down. But since the economic pie, productivity growth and overall growth has been slowing, certainly since the global financial crisis, workers are getting a smaller share of a pie which is not growing very quickly. So that force of pushing down average wage growth. It's also going to increase inequality if the labour share goes down, because most people get most of their income from their work. The people who get most of their income from capital and shares tend to be very rich. So if the labour share is falling, this increases overall household inequality. So that's another reason for worrying about it. Those are the kind of pure economic things, but of course more broadly, there can be social and political concerns about the rise of dominant firms. So maybe, it's not just these economic factors, maybe these firms, if they become very powerful, can skew the rules of the game, the rigged market, rigged economy type of idea. So Google recently overtook Goldman Sachs as the biggest firm that spent more on lobbying the US government than any other firm in the world. So as these firms are very big, they spend more on lobbying, they prevent competition authorities from working properly, they change laws and regulations, of course there's privacy issues. And this worry that there's this general democratic deficit could be fueling populist anger. These firms becoming more and more powerful. Maybe this is part of, sometimes people call this the new Gilded Age. The Gilded Age in America was in the early part of the 20th century when Rockefeller and the other big trusts were very dominant. And this was when there was eventually a big pushback against that, and the introduction of much tougher competition rules and ways of trying to deal with the power of these big trusts. So some people worry a lot about, well, maybe we're entering a new Gilded Age in the beginning of the 21st century like we did at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, so industrial organisation, IO economists, competition authorities, most of the focus is on specific industries. So there's kind of deep dives into banking or retail groceries or search engines. But it's the problem with it, that's perfectly legitimate to do. But the problem is it's harder then to step back and take a more wide-ranging view of what's happened across a wider range of industries. And I think this is why, although this phenomenon has happened, it's gone under the surface a bit, and it's only been recently when we've had this kind of explosion of big data sets covering almost all firms and many economies, we've been able to document what's going on. So there's two sources of these kind of big data sets. One is administrative data sets, which governments collect, which increasingly is being used by researchers. Another is private sector data sets, like accounting data sets. And people who've taken these type of data sets have used it to show there's this incredible variation across firms at any point of time. So, very big differences of productivity, of size, of wages, of management practices. So a lot of my work with Nick Bloom at Stanford has been about trying to measure management practices. And this is just a graph showing the distribution. I won't get into exactly how we measure the quality of management, but the one thing to take away from this is this enormous variation. So, whereas there's the UK, firms down here, they are not collecting any data about what's going on in firms, are not doing anything to try and set goals, not doing anything to try and incentivize workers. These firms shouldn't, these firms who are getting a low management shouldn't exist according to basic economic models. The competition should drive them out. Yeah, they exist everywhere. And they account for all the productivity differences between countries. Anyway, massive differences between firms. This is now well recognized in economics. It matters for productivity growth within countries and across countries. But what has been less recognized is how these have changed over time. And what I want to focus in the next 20 minutes or so is just to show you that these differences that we've seen in size and productivity have actually increased a lot in OECD countries. So the facts are going to be that if we look at industrial concentration, increased a lot since the early 1980s. The markup, which is, this is a more, of course we prefer this as a measure of market power, the difference in your price and your variable costs or your marginal costs. So the basic economic model says that, they should be equal because competition, if you're charging too high prices, then, consumers are going to buy somebody else, which drive prices down to variable costs. That wedge between price and variable costs is a measure of markup or market power. This seems to have increased substantially over time. And the question is, then, okay, I'm going to try and convince you this is true. What explains this? So the most popular explanation is that, this has got a real fun book actually. It's by a lawyer called Tim Wu at Columbia, and it's called The Curse of Bigness, and he's like railing against these firms. And he argues that it's due to weakened enforcement of competition policy. I'm going to, argue I don't think that is the main reason. In fact, I think there's kind of more deeper technological reasons, and reasons of globalization. So, and I'll come back. I think there is policy implication of what competition should do. We shouldn't be relaxed, but I don't think this is the main explanation. Anyway, we'll see. What are the explanations? Well, could be falling, could be weakened enforcement of competition. If my friend Thomas Philippon has a book on this, which is doing very well at the moment. They kind of argue for this, but there's lots of other explanations. So one explanation is to do with platform competition. So if you think about why is Google so dominant? Well, it's this kind of network effect they have. They've built a good search engine, and then lots of people use that search engine. And because lots of people use that search engine, you get more information on how people search. The more information you get, the better your search engine is. So you get this virtuous loop that the more people who use the search engine, the better it gets, and the more people who use it, kind of chicken and egg thing. And of course, Google then harvests that data and sells it to advertisers, and that's the way it makes all its money. But this kind of network effect, you can see it also in Facebook, it creates this kind of winner-take-all or winner-takes-most type of market. So fundamentally, I think that's kind of what's going on in some of these high-tech markets. That can't explain why it's happening in lower tech markets, but another reason why you might get the growth of these superstar firms in, say, lower tech markets is what I sometimes call the Walmart effect. And this is because, think about investments in intangible capital like software. So Walmart spends hundreds of millions of dollars on huge investments in software which track, in real time, how its goods move across different parts of the world. And it can use that to have this amazing logistics system and just-in-time inventory control system, which enables it to kind of make these kind of economies of scale, which is, there's no way some small independent chain could do that, or some mom and pop store has. So if these type of fixed costs will become more important, then that gives an advantage to bigger firms. So that's a second reason why this could happen. Another reason, a fourth reason, is that it might be that new technologies are not diffusing so quickly around the economy. So the OECD have argued that I show these increasing differences could be because it's harder to emulate and catch up. Or finally, there's also a kind of globalization effect, which kind of is the opposite to this falling competition story. So this is the idea, if think about China or other kind of big shocks to competition and globalization, what does that do? Well, it means that the smaller, less productive firms find it harder to survive. But it also means that some of the more productive firms could expand and get bigger market shares. So competition, if it makes consumers more sensitive to price or quality, can actually mean that you can also generate this kind of growth of largeness, because it makes the whole set of industries more winner-take-all industries. So there's some evidence in some industries that this is happening as well. So we like to say which one is true, and there's a whole industry here saying this is true, or this is true, or this is true. My personal view, and this is a personal view, is I think there's not one single story across everywhere holding for all markets. I think there are different stories in different markets. So I think my conclusion is that we do have to think about how these different, this kind of phenomenon is happening, but I don't think it's the one thing which is driving everything. I think things are different in different types of markets. So I absolutely believe that declining competition is true in some sectors. So I've worked a lot on US and British healthcare. I spent a year of my life working in the NHS, which was an interesting experience. But the US health is a total catastrophe. I mean, it's a real mess. And it's got worse because actually, there's been this wave of consolidation. So it's absolutely true in many sectors. I say airlines is also true in the US, that weak competition is part of what's going on. But there's three reasons I think it's not the main story. One is that if you look at the cross-country evidence I'll show you, these things are happening everywhere. In Europe, competition policy is Britain as well actually, has been enforced relatively toughly compared to the US. And you also see these same trends. Secondly, if you look at these characteristics concentrating industries, they're not the kind of, the industries which actually have had the biggest increases of concentration tend to be the more innovative industries and where productivity growth has been faster. So it's not the classical kind of, weak competition, lazy monopolist type of story. And the third thing is that if you look about what's happening, why has labour share fallen, concentration increasing? A lot of this is not because all firms are, having more profits and lower labour shares. The main thing happening is that there's this reallocation, so that the kind of the low profit firms are kind of exiting from the market, and the high profit firms, the bigger firms, superstar firms, are expanding. So it's not a generalised fall of competition. It's something which is kind of rewarding the more productive, more profitable firms. So, I'm going to say that the policy, we'll talk about a little about policy implications, and we're sure we'll talk more about this. So, I absolutely believe that we need to modernise and vigorously enforce competition policy. We need to think about new ways of doing it, as we're in a new kind of winner-take-all world. But in terms of understanding how we've got here, I think thinking that if we do this, it's going to reverse all the trends, I think is naive, actually. I think we have to recognise there's some deeper reasons for all this happening. Okay, so let me just kind of rush you through some facts, which I think, are good to know. So let's talk about differences of firm size. So in the US in 2016, there were about 2,600 firms who had more than 5,000 employees out of about 5 million firms, so about 0.03% of firms, not many firms. But they accounted for 36% of all jobs. So this small number of firms, 2,000 or 3,000 firms, accounted for over a third of all jobs. So that's, this is like, I think it's called, Gibrat first documented this in 1932, it's inequality of firms. This is true, it's skewed firm size distribution. But the interesting thing is the dominance of these big firms has increased since the mid-1990s. So mid-1980s. So in the mid-1980s, only about 28% of workers were in these mega firms, and now we're up to about 34%. So there's been this kind of big increase in terms of firm size, or the importance of these big firms for jobs. Now the problem with looking at jobs are great because you can measure them really well, but as my colleague at MIT, Eric Brynjolfsson, says, jobs are a pretty bad measure of modern firms. Because if you, have any of you been to the Google campus in Mountain View? You ever been there? You should. It's fantastic. It's real. It's amazing. The Michelin star food is pretty good. But one of the things that's really striking when you walk around it is how few people there are there. There's relatively few people. Of course, there's other places of Google around the world, but Google employs relatively few people given how big it is. And the same is true of Facebook. The same is true of Microsoft. A lot of these kind of the major superstar firms of the world today have this kind of phenomenon that Eric calls scale without mass. They have this enormous footprint in terms of the revenues or market value, but actually don't have many people who are employed there. So sales is maybe a better measure of revenue than just looking at jobs. So if you look at sales, this is the top 500 firms in the US. If you add up all their sales, it accounts for about $4 trillion in 1972, and that tripled by 2015. And so that tripling of the overall revenues in real terms of those firms, it isn't just the growth of the US economy. So if you kind of divide that by GDP or something, you can see that since the late 1980s, there's been a big increase relative to GDP. So firms are getting bigger in terms of jobs, in terms of sales. This is the UK actually. So this is from some work by the owners of the Bank of England. So that, again, the data only goes from 1998, but you also see a kind of increase in the relative size and sales of the top 100 businesses in the economy. But even this probably underestimates the role of large firms, because this is just saying adding up all the sales of different firms. But another thing which has happened to many firms over this time is that they've become more focused. So the era of conglomerates, where firms were in lots of different industries, that a lot of those firms have gone by the wayside, and firms tend to be more concentrated in one or two industries. So if you look at the share of sales relative to the industry that firms operate in, that's actually gone up by even more. So this is from work with some MIT and Harvard co-authors, where we went into the US ONS version. So that has the population of every firm in the US every 5 years, called the economic census. And then for every industry, about 800 industries, we calculated the share of sales of the top 4 firms or the top 20 firms or other kinds of measures since 1980. And when we did that, so this is for manufacturing, this is about 400 manufacturing industries. And this is the average across all those industries. We found that the concentration of sales gone, concentration employment had gone up, but not by very much. This is going to scale that mass. And if we look at the rest of the economy, we see this everywhere. So whether it's manufacturing, retail, wholesale, services, utilities, or so finance, you're not surprised, think about big banks, but you see this everywhere, this increase of concentration. So it really is a pretty much whole US phenomenon that industrial concentration has increased. This is wage inequality. This is by Nick Bloom, one of my former PhD students. We know that wage inequality has gone up a lot in the US. This is over kind of looking over 1981 to 2013 period. This is saying this blue points are saying that if you were in the bottom 20% of the US wage distribution over that 30-ish year period, you got basically no wage increase. So people at the bottom of the wage distribution in the US have actually had no increase in their real wage. So it's kind of stunning in a way. Whereas if you're at the top, as you know, got a big wage increase. But the interesting thing we have in this graph is that people think, well, you know, a lot of this must be driven by, if you look in a big firm, it's like the kind of the CEOs and the top people are getting loads of money and people at the bottom are getting nothing. But if you look within firms and look at within firm inequality, apart from the CEO, which is this top, it's really flat. And what this is saying is that this increase of inequality is not really that firms are paying people differently in the same firm. It's that firms are becoming increasingly different. You have some firms where almost everybody is highly paid, McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, and other firms where almost everybody is badly paid, like McDonald's. So really what's happened is that, you know, this increasing differences between firms in terms of size is also an increasing differences between firms in terms of the wages they pay people. So this is another, you know, phenomena which is happening at the same time as this increase of inequality. This is productivity. This is also showing that productivity differences between firms is increasing. And I could go on, but, you know, time is pressing on. So, you know, big increasing differences between firms in a number of dimensions. What about markups? So this other measure, you know, so concentration is one way of measuring firm power, but, you know, it's you know, could be going up for lots of different reasons. So what about this, you know, difference in price cost margins? Well, a crude measure of the price cost margin, the markup, is by looking at the labour share. So if you think about, you know, there's the share which goes to capitalists, the share which goes to labour. If the share which goes to labour goes down, it could reflect that what's happening is that the markup is going up. There's a bigger amount taken in profits. It could also reflect, of course, technology might be changing. So there's also an issue about whether, you know, the underlying tech. But if you said that technology is not biased against labour on average, but what's happening is just markups going up. This fall of the labour share that we've seen, this is the labour share of GDP in the US, which has gone down very dramatically, indicates that the markup has gone up. There's more sophisticated ways of measuring the markup. This is by, you know, Deloc here. This is using different kind of techniques. And this is also showing the same kind of pattern that, you know, back in 1980, there was about a 20% markup over marginal cost, and this has gone up to about 60% by the end of the period. So this suggests, this is publicly listed US firms, big increase in the markup. If you do this on all firms, not just the publicly listed, you see a similar kind of picture. This is from my own work about how you measure it. But this is one interesting fact. So this is the kind of weighted average markup across the whole economy. These lines are this is the median firm. So the typical firm in the US has not seen an increase in the markup. And this is just two different ways of measuring it, but showing the same thing. So for most firms, they haven't had increases of the profit markups. It's all being driven by what's happening at the top. And there's two things going on. One is the firms at the top are getting bigger markups, but the main thing actually is that more of the output of the economy is going to firms who already had big markups. It's this reallocation type of effect. So it kind of tells you a little bit about, you know, what might be going on underneath. Okay, so let's get on to some explanations and policy. So we found that concentration's gone up, markups have risen. This is this kind of reallocation driving the increase of markups. These were our different explanations. We can talk about them more maybe in the Q&A. I'm just going to focus on one of these, which is this kind of falling competition story. So why do I think the main story is this weakening of antitrust or competition policy? Well, one thing is that, you know, EU competition policy has remained very tough compared to the US, but it actually shows pretty similar trends to what we've seen. So here's what's happened to concentration. This is across 9 different European countries where we can get the same type of data as the US. And you can see in the kind of 2000s, there's been this increase of concentration, whether it's manufacturing or other sectors, just like there is in the US. So, you know, to me, this kind of suggests increase in concentration is happening in Europe, even though, you know, competition policy has been much tougher. This is the labour share, the kind of inverse of the markup. I showed you this was going down in the US, but it's also going down in Japan, it's also going down in Germany, it's also going down even in China. So the 4 biggest countries in the world, we see this kind of falling labour share. Directly measuring the markup, this is similar to the US work, but the markup seems to be going up in Europe, North America, Asia, Australasia, not so much in South America, interestingly, and even in Africa. So, this, I should say, markups are much harder to measure than just measuring labour share or concentration. So, there's a lot of issues about are these well measured or not, but the current type of findings suggest that, the trends look pretty similar, especially in Europe. What about the UK? So there's, again, some work in the Bank of England. They've tried to do some similar things on the markup. Interestingly, they also find stuff which is, pretty similar to the US. So an increase of the markup from, maybe 20% up to about 50% over marginal costs. What about other evidence on this weakening policy enforcement? Well, if you look at the industries where concentration markups are rising, interestingly, you might think prices should be going up, but in fact, prices don't seem to be going up. So, if you correlate the concentrate, prices are not rising. Productivity is rising. So, that's kind of glass half full, half empty. So productivity is rising, you think prices should fall. They're not going down, it's been taking more in profits, but prices are not rising. And these are more innovation seems to be going up as measured by TFP, total factor productivity growth, or site-weighted patents. These industries are growing faster. So these are not characteristics we normally associate with standard declining competition industries. They're kind of you have to think of these as the more kind of winner-take-all competition for the market rather than in the market. What about this rising intangible fixed costs? So there's some evidence that the industries which are more intensive in information technology have also had faster growth of markups and concentration. Some people say if you take these into account, that explains some of the markups, but not all of the markups. So I think two parts of the story. There is some evidence that what's happening is this increase in fixed costs of intangible capital, the kind of Walmart story, and there is some evidence for this kind of network effect because of this association with dynamism. Okay, so policy implications, and we can talk more about this, but I think in terms of competition policy, I don't want you to come away from this thinking, oh, well, we can all go home and be relaxed, because everything's hunky-dory. No. Even if we think these superstar firms got to these dominant positions through competing on the merits, that's to do with, network effects or intangible capital, doesn't mean we can be relaxed, because an economy dominated by a small number of firms is at more risk that these firms can start using their market power to the detriment of workers and consumers. So take the Microsoft. I worked in the Microsoft case for a couple of years back when I was running my consultancy firm on the non-Microsoft side, I should say, the European Commission side. And the case there was that Microsoft had got to a dominant position in operating systems, and basically because it was making products which outcompeted other products. Fine. But once it got there, it started doing things to keep out other rivals. So it did things to kind of stop Netscape from being able to compete in their web browsing services. It did things to Oracle and Sun Microsystems to reduce the degree to which its operating system worked with server operating systems. And those are all at the heart of the kind of the US and the European Microsoft case. So although Microsoft, I would argue, did get to their dominant position on the merits, once they got there, they started to do pretty anti-competitive things. And that is the serious risk, I think, we face with many of these companies. So when we think about competition policy, we have to think of too much competition policy is backward-looking. We say these two firms are merging. What are their market shares? If you put the market shares together, are they really are they high, like above 40 or 50%? If they're not, then we don't worry. But this is totally the wrong way to think about modern competition, because what we should be thinking of is when, say, a dominant firm starts taking over a new startup. The risk to that is that new startup could have become a competitor in the future. So you think about Facebook taking over WhatsApp, or Google taking over YouTube, or Facebook taking over Instagram. These could have been platforms competing with those dominant platforms in the future. But once they got taken over, they became part of the company, and it kind of kills off that competition. In fact, it's even worse than that. In some companies, like in the pharmaceutical sector, some companies actually take over startups with new medicines and then kill off the innovation, because they might be already producing a drug which would then compete with this potential new drug. So, I think that we have to think much more carefully about when we make decisions over mergers and acquisitions, this kind of future competition thing. We have to kind of, in my view, as Jean Charles says, shift the burden of proof more onto these dominant firms who want to merge with other firms that they're not going to engage in this type of activity, rather than making it the case that the government has to prove beyond any shade of a doubt that this anti-competitive thing will happen, which is kind of how it is now. We need to follow the Furman report, thinking about a digital regulator. Ultimately, there's the kind of Elizabeth Warren break him up. I don't think we're at the stage where we should necessarily break him up. I'd like to try some of the other things first, but this has to be seen on the table. This was done for AT&T. It was done. It was threatened for IBM, and I think ultimately, if we can't deal with the problem here, we do have to think about more radical solutions. One of the best ways of getting competition is trade openness. That stimulates more competition. But in fact, the whole, we're moving the opposite direction right now with the Trump trade wars, with Brexit. So, although I think another way of trying to stimulate competition is through trade openness, I think that this is something which is going into reverse gear right now. What about labour? So, in the labour market, we have this falling labour share that I mentioned, tends to increase inequality. That kind of strengthens the argument for redistribution, and in the area of slow productivity growth, that means slow wage growth. Here's the UK data. So you can see this incredible thing that we're still kind of below where we were in the start of the financial crisis in terms of real wages. How can we get back to more sustained real wage growth? Ultimately, I think more than anything else, we need sustained productivity growth. So I think we have to think about investments in innovation and human capital infrastructure. This was in the LSE Growth Commission that I was chairing for 5 or 6 years ago. And I think these things are still absolutely true. So this weak wage growth is reflecting this the lousy productivity growth. You see, productivity growth has been so flat since the global financial crisis, and there's lots of factors here. Austerity was one factor, and in the long term, these other factors are also important. So in conclusion, there's these massive industrial changes happening in the US and across the world. So in particular, this increase of concentration, these increases of markups. In my view, I don't think this is mainly driven by weak competition policy enforcement for the kind of reasons I outlined, the fact they're global, the concentration is dynamic, and it's reallocation. But that doesn't mean we can be relaxed against antitrust. We need to modernize it. And the key thing we need to think about, I think, is really to how we can raise productivity growth and therefore wage growth in this new winner-take-all kind of world. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you, John. I'm trying to figure out how to put all that together in my head.
I just downloaded a bunch of facts, and
there's something here about something that I don't quite get about the story, in that the story of the growth of superstar firms among the kind of sectors that have strong network effects is fairly intuitive.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Walmart in terms of other kind of superstar firms, but what's the kind of intuition, do you think, for why there should be a trend towards more superstar firms that gives them that concentration and that market power in non-network effect?
Okay, so there's a bunch of possibilities. I mean, one I think is, the story I think has some truth in Walmart and maybe many other sectors, is that there's been this. One of the other things which has happened is that there's a lot of technological advance in things like software, and you might think more broadly in terms of other intangible investments like R&D and things like that. And firms, a lot of the spending on that has a big kind of sunk fixed cost element to it. So these big ERP systems which they monitor inventory and logistics, and to make those kind of investments takes a lot of money.
Yeah.
And a small player can't really emulate the type of investments that a big player can. So I think that part of the story is that the growth of this type of Haskell and Sean was talking about this. If many of these intangible capital things have a big fixed cost, then you need to have profits to cover that fixed cost. So we have economies of scale. So that's one part of the story. So I think there's some truth in some sectors on that. Like the other stories could also be partly true in other sectors. I think the network effect and the one I just said are probably my I think in some sectors, like in some parts of manufacturing, globalization has also caused this to happen.
Yeah.
So why globalization? Well, globalization has this thing some call the Matthew effect. For those that have, more shall be given. For those that have little, more shall be taken away.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It means that one of the ironic features about tougher competition is that the more large productive firms get bigger and the smaller, less productive firms exit the market.
Yeah.
So you get this increase of concentration even though you have this increase of competition. So that's why concentration is hard often to interpret. People say, oh, competition's gone up, then competition's got to go down. Well, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
It depends on what the underlying causes are. So, one cause could be, globalization and increase. Another cause could be, and this is what I guess Tim Wu argues, it's like, regulators asleep at the wheel. That's possible. I think hospitals are like that in the US. So my view is it's different in different sectors.
Yeah.
And so I know it's unsatisfactory because it's much easier to say here's one story and that's it. And in fact, if you talk to my macroeconomic colleagues, they're all writing down models with one story and stuff. But I might be wrong, of course, but my gut feeling is it's not. It's a different story in different kind of sectors.
Because I guess because you've been advising on competition policy for years and years, and I guess if you look if you were back in the late 90s or whatever, and you were to foresee massive increase in online sales and all this kind of stuff, you would have said, this is going to be great for competition. That dispersion of firm productivity is going to shrink right down.
Yeah.
And it kind of hasn't worked out. And I wonder, is there anything in a split between business to consumer and business to business firms that might shed light on this kind of thing?
Well, I think there, again, it's this double-edged sword. So I think, the price comparison sites and the hotel.coms, that has helped competition, so people do compare. But I think what we underestimated is how good firms are at price discrimination. Right. So like when you fly, if you have one of those amazing pictures of who pays what on an aeroplane. And if you do bars, like some people are like up through the sky and another guy next to you is like down on the ground, because what firms have got so good at is being able to charge different prices to different people, depending on, the jargon, their elasticity, or how price elastic they are. So, that's why you have this dynamic pricing. So, closer you get to flying, the more expensive it gets. But also you have other more subtle things, the air miles. So, and you also see that in other, online pricing things, that firms become increasingly good at discriminating across different individuals and across different businesses, I think, in terms of how they can charge. So they're actually better at extracting some of the profit. So I think a lot of the extraction of the benefits has actually disproportionately gone to the producers rather than the consumers because of that. And we underestimated. That's to me. Yeah, could be all getting together and colluding as well.
Yes. That's a really interesting thought, that the information flow actually went two ways and it benefited the producers more than the consumers.
Yeah, they're a lot smarter than us.
Yeah, it turns out.
You know who the biggest employer of newly minted North American PhD is in the world? What do you guess? Federal Reserve or Harvard University? Amazon.
Right.
Amazon. They hoover up PhDs to the job market, and these guys are all doing exactly this. They're kind of looking at the data, pricing, look and feel of websites, other ways of trying to better do things to, get more money out of the punters. Wow. Great use of human capital.
Right, who wants to throw in a question at this point?
Hi. Do you think international tax evasion schemes have had any effect on the rise of these big companies and productivity in general? And do you think the proposed sort of tech taxes floating around Europe now could have any impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I definitely, I'm a consumer of this work rather than, although I started my career at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, I have to say, I soon gave up and tried to understand the corporate tax system in the kind of detail that, people like Rachel Griffith have. But as a consumer of many of the people who work, like Gabriel Zuckman and other people, it does seem that there's a lot of evidence that these global firms are becoming much better at moving around where they take their profit. So especially as, a lot of this is intellectual property, and you can kind of take that almost anywhere, really, because it's very hard to prove where the ideas were created. So his work and other people's work does suggest that, they are getting a lot of profits from just arbitraging across different types of tax systems. So I do think, as a principle of taxation in this kind of, more globalized world, some type of a sales-based principle. So instead of trying to figure out, where the profits are made, which is so difficult, you just say, where's the stuff sold, which you can monitor, would be a much better principle for international taxation. So the tech tax, which is kind of a little bit getting towards that, I think has a lot of merit. I mean, you'd like to coordinate that internationally a bit more, which I guess there's some attempt to do that through the OECD, and I think that's good. But I guess the strategy has been, if you can't do that, get the US to the bargaining table by doing what we're currently doing. So I think that that general move towards having sales-based corporate taxation, tech tax may be part of that mix. It'd be good to have some more global agreements on that, but it's I think it is, a pretty much important problem. It is difficult to do because like so many of the problems, you're in the right place. So many of the problems we face as a species are completely global issues. So the taxation of companies, dealing with climate change, dealing with the challenges of technology, of military conflict. Yet the dynamic which we're having now is in the opposite direction. It's back to nationalism and nation states. And nation states by themselves in the modern world just simply can't solve these type of problems. You need to have some coordination, but it's it's tough. I mean, you hope somehow the realization is going to come, and maybe the tech tax is a way to do that. But it's an example of this underlying challenge, which I guess you're grappling with, or all grappling with.
I have I guess two questions. First one is regarding sort of your explanation of the rise of this massive firm in all different industries, whether you've considered that potentially, especially the time period that you were looking at involves a couple of crises, especially one of them, the financial crisis, being particularly big, and obviously this has effects on firms that vary massively by size. So the longer the crisis, you'd expect potentially larger firms to survive better, either because their access to finance is not restricted as much, or because of whatever explanation I'm sure you can think of plenty. And also maybe their ability to benefit from what is happening during the financial crisis, whether it is ability to fire workers whose jobs you could have replaced with robots, but before it was much harder, but now because this crisis is going on is much easier, or whether it is like prices of things may be falling because your sort of supply chains are struggling, and you can scoop up these benefits, and sort of 10 years later you see this rise of the super firm that is potentially also aided by this really, really deep, the adverse effect of this sort of lengthy financial crisis. And so it's not really, and I'm not saying this applies to, obviously, it's not a story that would explain everything, but it's not really that firms are doing things better or different. It's more there was this massive adverse event that benefited massively people with firms with bigger size relative to small size.
So the financial crisis did have this enormous effect. You see in the UK, like in many other countries, it's true. All the problems that you see in wages and productivity growth happened after the financial crisis, and I certainly think that in terms of understanding what's happened to productivity, the shadow of the financial crisis is a big deal. So all those things could be happening, and for maybe the European data where we don't have such a long time series, it's like 2000 onwards, could be some things in there. But I think with the US work, which we looked 1980, and I showed you some of the graphs on relative size and concentration, those trends were happening long before the financial crisis. So those graphs of concentration I showed you started 1982 and ended in 2012. So maybe the last 5 years could be affected, but the other 25 years are all pre-financial crisis. So I think that the general trends are actually much longer secular trends, including the labour share fall as well. So I don't think it's just the financial crisis. I mean, the other kind of big thing in the 2000s, I guess, is like integration of China and to some extent India in the global economy, and especially after China joined the World Trade Association, the World Organization in December 2001. So that also could be an effect. But my sense is that because this has happened for 30, 40 years now, it's something which is those things of course are very important. but it's a more long-run thing than something which is a kind of business cycle thing. I mean, historically, interesting, if you look at the business cycle, the labour share, for example, of GDP usually rises in the downturn, and that's because profits are much more cyclical than wages are, traditionally. So, the markup tends to kind of shrink during a downturn because profits are fall relatively more than wages. So, in fact, during the immediate crisis, you actually see an increase of the labour share. Not in the US actually, but in most of the country as well. But yeah, I mean, I guess my main answer is I think it's a long run effect rather than a short run effect, cyclical effect.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to pick up a question about globalization that you just mentioned. You mentioned that one of the effects of globalization is increased competition, but that competition has led to weaker firms falling out and therefore increased concentration. But then also on one of your previous slides, you were worried that declining trade will actually weaken competition and be a problem. And I actually think both things can be true at the same time. So, but as policymakers, how do we find our way through that? If increasing trade is actually going to just reinforce the concentration effects, but also weakening trade and trade frictions and the trade war is actually also going to, mean these established big superstar firms are going to stay entrenched because there's less competition. How do policymakers navigate that and solve that tension?
So I mean, on the pure globalization, I think the reducing trade barriers and expanding markets, the fact that causes increase of concentration, I think is actually, from a purely economic point of view, is a good thing, because as the market becomes bigger and more players can potentially come in, that kind of disciplines the big players. So they might get bigger because they can expand more productive, but they're kind of disciplined by the fact they're operating in a small global market. So in that, globalized product market, that is generally a good thing, and we could be relatively relaxed about that. The problem is, of course, that maybe we're leaving things out of that simplistic model, and maybe when they get big, they can do other anti-competitive things to weaken their rivals, like the Microsoft case, or they can start making investments in lobbying and rigging the rules of the game, so lobbying senators to do different things to change rules and regulations to drive up more barriers for other domestic things. So that's so I guess if you go back to the history, the Sherman Act is one of the foundational documents of US antitrust competition policy. And when Sherman was putting it in there, he said, there's two reasons we want to have competition policy, antitrust policy. One is that we want to do it for the good of consumers, so that's the kind of so globalization would be good and everything, more competition would be good for that. But the second thing is we're worried about the political system, because the bigger firms are, the more they have power to skew the political system. And that's actually, so Brandeis is another kind of Supreme Court justice. The curse of bigness comes from him. So he also, and the tradition of antitrust, you don't just think about the markups or market size or concentration, you also just think about the overall scale. So that second thing, economists have kind of driven that out, like on the University of Chicago, because we think about markets. But maybe we're wrong, because maybe we're leaving out the political economy, and there is this kind of political economy risk that these firms are so big, they can invest so much in skewing the political system that it becomes a problem because of that. I don't know the answer to that. The problem is, you can think about guidelines and criteria, like mergers. We have pretty good guidelines about understanding if two firms get together, when that's going to cause a problem. At what point, when a firm becomes over a certain size, is it a political problem? How do we judge? So Luigi Zingales from Chicago has got a conference coming up where he thinks, our political economy models are good enough now to start coming up with guidelines about dealing with the curse of bigness. I'm not quite so convinced, but I think that this is a totally legitimate debate to have. Economists have tended to kind of poo-poo this type of stuff. I think it is a definite issue.
Sorry, that was going to be my second question. Was what do economists have to do differently to analyze these things? It sounds like one thing is think about scale in the political economy, not just competition.
Exactly.
And I guess it also sounds like economists need to think about how we think about future competition.
Yes.
So that when we think about killer acquisitions, it's not just competition now, but the potential for competition.
Yeah, and I think that's in a way an easier thing to do, because that's already in the kind of current antitrust setup. That the competition are meant to think about those things, but as a matter of fact, they tend not to. Now, I'll tell you why that's the case in the US. In the US, if the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission wants to say block a merger, so Facebook, Instagram, or Facebook, WhatsApp, it considered this. But to do that, you have to make a case in front of a judge, and and the opposition will be the companies who all so have a lot more money than the government does actually. But the problem is, I think, more that the judge themselves will look at the burden. There's a high burden of proof. The government has to really prove that when Facebook took over WhatsApp really could have led to a platform threat. And of course, the other side can say, well, you've got your economists saying this, but here's my economist saying the opposite. Anything could happen in 10, 20 years' time. This is total speculation. And, the body of case law inherited by judges is pretty conservative. They put a lot of weight on, the evidential proof. And of course, for future, there's not much evidence, there's not much empirical evidence. So I think, I've talked to quite a few lawyers about this, and it is possible to change that, but you have to bring in legislation to change that. So you have to actually, explicitly say the standards and burden of proof are pushed more towards onto the party. That's easier to do in Europe, and maybe where European, competition policy has been tougher, because the Commission only has to, has an oral hearing where in a way it's judge, jury, and executioner. So that may have other problems, but it's kind of slightly easier to kind of hold the line, I think. But even there, it's like, you are. I mean, in the Microsoft case, we did a lot of work, good work, I thought, showing these dynamic effects of future competition. But in the final judgment, it's hardly any of that, because the Commission was too worried about legal challenge. Because where's your evidence for this? Where is the proof that this happens instead of something else happens, or something else happens? So So I think the only way to deal with that, given that we have more evidence that it's a problem, is to shift the standards of burden of proof. That's my view on that.
Thanks. Two questions, if I may. So first, if we can solve the lobbying problem, and if we can solve the sort of cartel issue, can you maybe weigh up a bit more the potential upsides of having these big firms? I mean, they're pretty innovative. They have lots of resources to give to R&D. So if you can solve all these huge problems, what's the upside of all this? And then a second question, if I may, which is actually related to some previous research you did on measuring the quality of management. We're doing a bit of research on training and skills and the effect of the apprenticeship levy in the UK, and we're seeing, I don't know how familiar you are with the policy, but basically firms
Not
have
familiar enough.
The firms have to sort of give up some money for training. The effect we're seeing from our research so far is there's a shift towards higher levels and towards more service firms, and in the southeast of England. And a lot of these firms are spending them on basically doing MBAs and sending people who are already graduates on various sort of management courses. I wonder, is everybody doing an MBA going to really improve the sort of productivity of the firm and the quality of management? So I know that was not related to what you're talking about today, but we're very interested in what you might have to say on that.
Sure. On the big firms, big firms have a lot of advantages. I mean, like I said, the standard economic model is that, as I said, firms are different. Big firms are big because they're generally more productive, or they're more innovative, they have some advantage. So there's nothing wrong with big firms being big, and often Globalization will give them more through this method, and that's not in and of itself necessarily a problem. So economies of scale as well. So I think that I think there are often the small is beautiful agenda is somewhat exaggerated. Small firms generally pay less wages and have less good health. So I've no problem with the kind of big firms per se, but I think it's more that you have to make an assessment about in some circumstances are they likely to actually abuse that position of dominance in terms of what they do to consumers. The political economy stuff, but also the stuff we were just talking about now, getting the antitrust and competition framework right, and dealing with the lobbying thing is not as easier said than done, right? I mean, there's there is a enormous industry out there which I think is difficult to deal with. On the So I certainly don't think everybody should have an MBA, even though I teach MBA students. So, you should always do my course. I think if anything about MBAs, actually, the stuff we teach on the work we showed management quality, actually is very, and the MBAs are all learning all this highfalutin stuff about strategy and sophisticated pricing type of things. Our stuff is much more basic. Given what you're doing, how can you do it more productive? Objectives, collecting data, promoting people based on the merits rather than whether they're the eldest son of the founder, that kind of thing. So actually, those kind of basic type of things, I actually think there's a lot to actually improving information and helping people benchmark themselves and how to improve themselves on those type of dimensions. So I don't know you get a lot of that with MBA though. I think a lot of these things are much more the kind of basic things consultants actually go into when they first see a firm. They do a diagnostic and then they kind of try to put a plan together to improve. So for big firms, that's not an issue because they've been doing this. But for small and medium-sized enterprises, McKinsey's not going to deal with an SME. There isn't that same thriving sectors in management consulting sector for those smaller firms. So I think there is a role. But I don't think that a good. I mean, my gut instinct is a good use of apprenticeship isn't spending it all on going for 2-year MBAs. I think you'd want to deal with things which are much more basic than that, which short courses, some of the types of kind of consultancy, operational consultancy, or other kinds of things that could be helped with. So that would be my my sense of what to do. Although if you want to come and do an MBA, it's slow enough. We can talk. I'll tell you one bit of information. We collected in our surveys that we did when we started in 2004. We collected on information on MBAs, and we got this one result. We thought, oh yeah, this is great. The MBAs were associated with much higher productivity. The more managers which are trained in MBA, the more productive you were. But it turned out when you control for other things like the general education of the workforce and training, that effect disappeared. Although it did help you talk up your management practices.
Yeah, so I just was interested, obviously we've talked about the rise in the big firms, but I was wondering how much we know about the rest of the distribution and whether there's something similar, in the labour market we talk about a disappearing middle. Is it the same with firms? Are we having, because perhaps of the new platforms available allow lots of very small firms to develop? Is there a similar trend going on? Or
so it's a really interesting question. I don't think in the US data, which I know better, it really does look like a shift upwards. So one of the other things that's happening, which I didn't put up over this period, is what John Halterwanger from the University of Maryland calls declining business dynamism. So the other thing in the US, which is quite stunning, is that if you look at the fraction of workers in young firms, think of those entrepreneurial firms, that's been going down over the last 25 years. Or if you look at the rate of new entry, that's also been going down. So and all the mobility of people across different jobs, that's also been going down all across different places. So, in fact, it doesn't look like it's not the Alan Manning polarization thing. It's more like this shift of the distribution up towards the top. I'm not so. I mean, I'm trying to do some work in the UK actually on doing similar things. It's the data is not quite as good, although we're kind of putting better databases together, and OECD is doing so. That, I mean, there is this phenomena of the best and the rest. So the top firms near the frontier are kind of pulling away from those firms near the bottom in terms of their productivity. But I think in the overall size distribution, it's more just this shift of the mass of the distribution towards the top.
I had a question about you were talking about future competitions. This builds on a couple of previous questions. On the one hand, if breakup is on the table, that if you go down that route, maybe that deals with some of the short-term abuses of market power, but it doesn't necessarily address the network effects which lead to the concentration over time. Oh. And so what would you do? But equally, you sort of said, well, maybe sometimes it's okay to have scale because they might be more productive or they might invest in R&D or that sort of thing. So what should you be designing for when when trying to sort of structure a future competition? Should you be trying to weaken network effects, even though they might be kind of good for consumers, or is there some other criteria that you should be sort of aiming for?
Yeah, so it's great. It's a great question. I think one of the things, so in many of these digital markets, the key resource is data. So one of the things that, is like what I described with Google is you get more data on consumers, and that enables you to build a bit of algorithm. The fact of getting more data on consumers as you're doing this is not necessarily something you want to all be accumulated by one company. So I think one of the changes, policy innovations you could think of, is kind of, if you think data is the essential facility, how you get better access to that essential facility. So rather than all the data being captured and controlled by by Google or Facebook, you provide some mechanism through which other people can get access to that essential facility. So in the same way that, when we think about access to, telecoms backbone firms, so that BT is not the only firm that controls all mobile firms, we have access, or in railroads we want to have access and interoperability. Similarly, you might think with data you want to set up a system whereby other firms, new startups could get access to that data. Now I know that kind of cuts across the privacy agenda, of course, because the more you say that data is available, the bigger risk it might spill out to other people. So that's one thing to be careful about. But I think that if you thought about that framework, which has established kind of legal and economic doctrine, we could think about this as the kind of essential facility. So these firms are great just because they're brilliant and they can make better use of their data and their thinking. That's why they're doing so well. Okay, fine. But if the reason they're doing well is just they've captured the essential facility, the essential data, then I think this type of intervention could be something which could be effective. And that's kind of what, say, if you had a sectoral digital regulator, which I think is kind of seems to be happening here, which is a good thing. That's the type of thing we could think of doing. Of course, again, it goes back to the global kind of local question. So, doing it in the UK by itself is not much. European-wide, GDPR, I think, has been a step in the right direction, and you could think of other steps like that to try and democratise access to some of this data.
That's it. John, thanks very much. It's 2:00, so we should draw it to a close, but you've given us a huge amount to think about, and it's obviously a very rich theme for policymakers to be thinking about, and plays out in lots of the work we're doing, the tech work and everything else too. So we'll be interested to see what you come up with next in this, but for now, thank you very much.